In 1989, I was serving as interim youth minister for my home congregation, Central Church of Christ in Wichita, Kansas. And in the summer of '89, we sponsored a citywide work camp. There were perhaps a dozen or 15 congregations of the Church of Christ in the Wichita area, and we had teenagers from most of them involved in this camp, about 200 kids in all. And if my memory serves me, when all was said and done, I think we scraped, prepped, and painted 26 houses that week. And we used about 600 gallons of paint. Now, about half of that paint I was able to collect from paint stores in an arrangement that, as I understood it and as I presented it, was a win-win situation. I contacted those stores a couple of months in advance and told them that we'd be happy to relieve them of any mismixed paint they had accumulated over the next couple of months. This paint they were more than happy to give us because mismixed paint or oops paint is difficult to sell, and if they don't sell it, they have to pay to dispose of it. But since we were recycling it, and so saving them the recycling cost, they were happy for me to come and pick it up and take it off their hands. Now, the way that I was able to use that paint was by mixing it together to create common colors. About a week before the event, I rented a cement mixer. And I took all the paint out on the church parking lot and sorted it by basic color categories, putting all the blues together and all the greens together and all the browns together and so on. I'd pour all the blues into the mixer and come up with 60 gallons of blue paint. It was all the same color. Pour it into 5-gallon containers and then move on to the next color. Now, in between colors, and I later realized that this step was mostly unnecessary, that it would have been sufficient to clean the mixer once when I was all finished, but in between colors, I was taking a water hose and rinsing out the contents of the cement mixer so that the previous color wouldn't taint the next color. Seemed like a good idea at the time. But what I didn't account for was the fact that gravity is a constant and water runs downhill. And our church building was downtown, right next door to the Emprise Bank building, whose air intake conduit faced the downslope of our parking lot. Now, I didn't notice their parking lot filling up with people as they evacuated the building. But I did notice the 5 fire trucks that pulled up to investigate the cause of the toxic fumes that forced the evacuation of the building. And I sure took notice when I found myself confronted by the fire marshal and a field officer of the EPA, who gave me till sundown to clean up the 100 gallons or so of paint water that remained on the church parking lot or face a $10,000 fine. Which, by the way, if you're ever faced with the prospect of such a cleanup, the recommended method for soaking up such a liquid spill is kitty litter. Pour it on, it absorbs it, soaks it right up. The only drawback is that 200 pounds of kitty litter quickly becomes 2,000 pounds of wet kitty litter. And it's no small task to shovel up a ton of wet kitty litter and deposit it in the dumpster. Now, when this incident occurred, I found it personally embarrassing because even though I didn't actually make it home in time to watch it all unfold on the evening news, it seems that all 800 members of the congregation did, including the elders. Moreover, all of my peers, my fellow youth ministers in town, saw it, and as did most of the kids in the youth group. Now, as it turns out, that wasn't such a bad thing. Most of the people who saw it simply found the whole thing amusing. The elders were just happy that I had handled it and that there was nothing left for them to do. And it actually made me something of a celebrity among my fellow youth ministers, who, if you didn't know, as a class, get a real kick out of disrupting the order of things, particularly if you can pull it off with a credible appeal to plausible deniability as far as any intent to cause any real harm. And it made me positively legend among the kids in the youth group who kind of loved the idea of having a youth minister who was known to the authorities. Now, even though that actually turned out pretty well for me, and it gave me a great story to tell, I have to tell you that I felt badly about it. Not about what actually occurred, because it was an innocent mistake, and frankly, the fumes that I created were those of watered down latex paint. They were not toxic, and would very likely not have even alarmed the people at the bank if they had known what the smell was. And had I not been compelled to sop up the water with kitty litter, it would have evaporated, leaving nothing but a faint stain on the parking lot, which stain would have washed away in a few months, causing no more environmental damage than was caused when, at the end of every workday, at the actual work camp, everybody washed out their paintbrushes on the lawns. The difference being that that spill of paint water was spread out over many sites. Now, I didn't feel bad about my supposed environmental crime. I felt bad because I had exposed the church to a degree of shame, to a degree of public embarrassment. But the twinge of embarrassment that I felt in regard to the fiasco of recycling that first 300 gallons of paint was nothing compared to the level of shame, the sheer mortification that I experienced in regard to the comparatively simple transaction of purchasing the second 300 gallons. You see, the first 300 gallons of paint was acquired as a matter of service. Yes, the church and those we were serving were receiving a benefit from collecting this paint, but so were the retailers from whom I got the paint. But when it came to the paint we needed to buy, the transaction was different, because in that situation, I was just one more customer. So I approached that transaction differently. When it came to buying that paint, I went to a discount home improvement warehouse store and I talked to the manager. And I told him that I would be needing to buy a high number of 5-gallon buckets of their least expensive white latex exterior paint, but that I wouldn't know until our event was in progress how many buckets I would need. But I figured I would need at least 20 5-gallon buckets and probably more than that, so I wondered if we could get a volume discount. And that's very important. What I asked for was a volume discount. Curious, he asked me what kind of event we were doing, and I told him that we had a couple of hundred teenagers from churches across the town who were going to be painting houses as part of a work camp. And intrigued, he said, well, I can't give you a volume discount because you're not a contractor. But I can give you a charity discount because churches are 501c3 charitable organizations. And I accepted his offer. I accepted the discount. And I've regretted that decision ever since. Because by accepting that discount, I brought shame on the church. You see, at the time when I accepted the discount, I didn't understand Matthew 10, 9 through 10. But by the time the work camp was over, I sure did. In this passage, Jesus gave the apostles instructions for their first missionary journey, commonly referred to as the mission of the 12. And he gave them a variety of instructions for how they were to conduct this mission. But in Matthew 10, 9 through 10, he tells them in specific terms how this mission was to be funded. Matthew 10, 9 through 10, do not take along any gold or silver or copper in your belts. Take no scrip for the journey, or extra tunic, or sandals, or a staff, for the worker is worth his keep. Specifically, Jesus told the 12 that they were not to fund the mission of the 12. They were the workers for the mission, and what they were contributing to the mission was their own time, effort, unique experience, and expertise as apostles of Christ. So they were not to take any gold or silver or copper of their own on this journey, and they were not to take a set of work clothes to do odd jobs on the side and pay for the mission that way. Rather, Their expectation was to be that the mission would be funded by others. Now, this particular mission was an evangelistic mission, which is different from a mission of mercy. This mission was to be funded by those who received the apostles, heard the word, obeyed the word, and submitted to Christ as their sovereign Lord. Whereas missions of mercy are to be funded by the church, by the Christians who send out the missionaries to do the work of grace that they do. However, when it comes to funding, there's something that gospel missions and missions of mercy have in common. Neither one is to be funded by the workers who actually carry out the mission, and neither one is supposed to be funded by the general public. That's what Jesus is saying when he says in Matthew 10:10, take no scrip for the journey. Now, in most translations here, it simply says take no bag for the journey. But that translation is misleading because the Greek word there, pira, as Jesus used it in this context, doesn't refer to just any bag. The word pira here refers to a specific kind of bag. A pira is a street preacher's begging bag. You see, being an itinerant preacher, teacher, prophet, or healer in the first century in Palestine was a pretty common profession. In some cities, street preachers were as common as our street musicians in the French Quarter in New Orleans. And they made their living pretty much the same way. So that just as a street musician sets out a coffee can or a hat or an open guitar case, so a street preacher in first century Palestine would set out a scrip. And everyone knew what a scrip was and what it was for. It was a begging bag. And it was for soliciting donations from the general public. And when it comes to missions of the church, Jesus says, no. Absolutely not. The church is not a public trust. The church is a sacred trust. And when I accepted a donation for the church from the manager of the Home Depot, I violated the sacred trust. Now, I didn't realize it at the time, but the fact of the matter came to roost with me in a big way before that work camp was over. You see, when work camp first started, we didn't know for sure just how much paint we would need. We didn't know exactly how many kids would attend. We didn't know how efficient the work crews would be. We didn't know how many gallons of paint it would take to cover the number of square feet we wanted to cover. And when you're working with teenagers, you've got to count for the paint that winds up in places other than on the wall. So when I first went to buy paint, I bought 100 gallons, 20 5-gallon buckets. And on that day, the store manager was happy to see me, happy to sell me paint, and he said, I'm always happy to help out with a good cause. 2 days later, when I needed a second 100 gallons of paint, he didn't say much of anything. He just furrowed his brow at me and acted slightly annoyed. 2 days after that, when I went to buy a third batch of 20 5-gallon buckets of paint, he said, look, I like to help out when I can, but I just can't give and give and give. I'll sell you paint today, but this is it. I'm cutting you off. I can't just keep giving. And that stung. And I thought to myself, really? This is really how it is? Because my first reaction was to be indignant. I mean, at that time, Central Church of Christ was the largest Church of Christ for 150 miles in any direction. We had 850 members, 120 kids in the youth group. The congregation was giving between $12,000 and $15,000 a week, which was no record, but it was a respectable contribution for a congregation of that size in 1989. We had 5 full-time ministers, 2 secretaries, and a maintenance staff, and we supported a number of full-time missionaries. Not only that, but all the kids who were participating in the work camp had paid a $50 registration fee for the camp, so I had a $10,000 budget for this event, in addition to what we had budgeted for the event in the youth budget. And this guy is selling me $30 buckets of paint for $27 and he gets to bust my chops for that? I mean, I spent $1,600 on paint from his store, not to mention all the brushes and other painting supplies I bought from him, and he gets to make me feel like a beggar because he saved me $180? So my first instinct was to be angry. As I was standing there stewing over the fact that this guy is scolding me as though I were a greedy child who had come back to the cookie jar one too many times. So I said, "Don't worry, I won't be back." But then, as I was driving back to the church, it hit me. Indignance wasn't the right response, though anger was, but my anger was misdirected. I was right to be angry about what had just happened, but there was no cause to be angry with this store manager. He wasn't the one in the wrong. I was. There was nothing wrong with his behavior. He was just taking care of business, and he was doing so in keeping with the values of good business practice. The person whose behavior was out of line was me. And not because I had violated any tenets of good business practice, though I may have done that, I don't know. After all, I'm not a businessman, I'm a churchman. And good business practices are not my first duty. My first duty is to adhere to good church practice. And I became derelict in that duty when I paid no heed to what Jesus had said in Matthew 10, 9 through 10, and allowed this mission of the church to be supported, even though by only about 1%, by someone outside the church. Because in so doing, I set the order of things as Christ intended them to be, upside down. The church is not a public trust. The church is a sacred trust. You see, when an organization like the American Red Cross or the Muscular Dystrophy Association or the March of Dimes, which are secular organizations, or even organizations like Habitat for Humanity or St. Jude's Children's Hospital, which are para-church organizations founded in the name of Christ, when an organization like that solicits donations from the general public, it becomes a public trust. That is, by receiving support from the general public, they become accountable to the general public. So if, for instance, you write a check to the Red Cross and designate that money to be used for earthquake relief in Haiti or whatever you designate it for, you have every right to ask for an accounting of that donation, to ask for verification that the money you gave was spent in the way that you intended for it to be spent. Not only that, but if the Red Cross applies for and receives a grant from the federal government, then you, as an American taxpayer, even if you've never personally given a dime to that charity, have every right to know how that money is being spent, and every right to voice your disapproval if you're unhappy with the way that it's being spent. Because the Red Cross is a public trust, and you are the public, and they are accountable to you. But the church, if we adhere to the guidelines that Jesus gave us in Matthew 10, should never be a public trust, but a sacred trust. Because the church and the work of the church is never to be supported by the general public. The church is to be supported only by those who have surrendered to the peace of Christ. The church is to be supported only by those who have become expatriates of the world in order to become patriots of the kingdom of God. The church is to be supported only by those who have submitted themselves to the authority of the apostles who, through the written word, govern the church in the name of Christ. The church is to be supported only by those who have received Christ willingly as their conquering king, and so give to him as any citizen of any kingdom gives to his sovereign Lord. And those who receive those gifts in his name, as his appointed stewards, will be held accountable by God and by their fellow citizens of the kingdom for how they use those gifts. However, If the church is supporting herself as she should, if the church is supporting its own missions as she should, then there is no basis for anyone outside the church to even have an opinion about that. Who within the church gives, how much they give, or how the money is spent? Frankly speaking, so long as the church is abiding by Matthew 10, 9 through 10, the finances of the church are none of the world's business. Period. Now, the world thinks it's their business. But the only reason the world thinks that is because giving involves money. And as far as the world is concerned, money and the exchange thereof falls into their purview. Now, they have no interest in the church otherwise. They don't really care what we believe or why we believe it, except when our beliefs involve the giving and receiving of money. They don't really care that we put our Pledge of Allegiance to the cross of Christ over and above our Pledge of Allegiance to the flag, except for the fact that we put a higher value on giving than we do on paying taxes. They really don't care about our faith claims. They don't care that we believe that Christ is risen. They don't care that we believe that we shall rise. They don't care that we believe that Christ is truly present with us in the elements when we partake of the Lord's Supper. They don't care what we believe or practice in regard to reading the Bible, washing feet, speaking in tongues, laying on hands, water baptism. They don't care about what we teach and practice in regard to 1 Corinthians 15 at all. But they sure as shootin' care about what we teach and practice in regard to 1 Corinthians 16:1. Now, concerning the collection. Oh, they're all over that. Now, there's nothing we can do to reverse the world's thinking on this. As far as the world is concerned, money falls within their purview. Money falls within their bailiwick, and there's nothing we can do to change their minds about that. But there is something we can do to prevent the world's point of view from becoming our reality. There is something we can do to rob the world of its ability to legitimately act on its instinct. There is something we can do to prevent the world's point of view from ever gaining any legitimacy. And that is to adhere without any deviation to what Jesus said in Matthew 10:10. When we set out to do the work of our Lord that he has set before us to do, take no scrip with us. Take no begging bag. Never do what I did on that fateful day in June of 1989, innocent as it seemed at the time. Never open the door for allowing anyone outside the church to gain so much as a faint claim to legitimacy, to do so much as to utter a word of criticism against us in regard to how we conduct our finances. Not even by accepting something as innocuous seeming as a charity discount. In this matter, I think we should follow Abraham's lead and take the attitude that he had when he returned from the War of the Nine Kings. Genesis 14:17 and following. Abram was traveling through the Shava Valley, also known as the King's Dale, as he returned from his victory over Kedorlaomer and the Amraphel alliance, when he was greeted by the king of Sodom and by Melchizedek, who was both king of Salem and priest of the Most High God. Melchizedek gave him bread and wine and pronounced this blessing: "Blessed be Abram by the Most High God, the creator of heaven and earth. Blessed be the Most High God for handing over your enemies to you." Then Abram gave Melchizedek a tithe of everything. Then the king of Sodom said to Abram, "Turn my people over to me, and you can keep all the spoils for yourself." But Abram replied to the king of Sodom, "I raise my hand in the presence of Yahweh, the Most High God, the creator of heaven and earth. I will not accept one thread from you, not one sandal strap. You will never be given the opportunity to say, I made Abram rich. No, nothing from me. I agree to keep only what my men have already eaten. However, you're free to give a share to my allies, Anir, Eshcol, and Mamre. Here, Abraham, the father of the faithful, was returning from battle, a battle in which he had been victorious. So he was returning as a conquering king. And in the midst of his return home as a triumphal hero, he humbled himself before God, acknowledging that his victory had been handed to him by God. Then, greeted by Melchizedek, who was a type and shadow of Christ, he received from him a blessing of bread and wine, which is a type and shadow of the Lord's Supper. And he gave to Melchizedek a tenth of all that he had, which is a type and shadow of the contribution. Then Abraham, who was himself a type and shadow of the church, for as it says in Hebrews 7, all the children of Abraham were in his loins at this time, so we as children in Christ are to walk in faith after his example. So Abraham, as our exemplar of faith, in this very passage cited in Hebrews 7, when offered a share of the spoils of war beyond what he discerned as rightfully his own by the hand of God, said no. No. No one other than God himself is to be given the opportunity to say, I made Abram rich. And that ought to be the exact same attitude that we have as the Church of Christ. No. No one outside the church is to be given the slightest opportunity to say, I made the church rich. The church is not a charity. The church is not a public trust. The church is a sacred trust. She is the bride of Christ, the bride of the conquering king. And the gifts she receives by right. For they come to her by the hand of her own subjects, and no one else. Now that would seem to be a pretty simple matter. Something that would be pretty easy to keep in place and maintain. And it would be, if all we were talking about was money, if all that was in view was the collection and the work of the church, and if all that was in view was the church budget. But there's more to this discussion than simply that. Because the financial interests of the church and the spiritual implications of those interests go far beyond the collection, far beyond the simple matter of the church budget. There are interests in the world, interests which have no allegiance to the cross or to the kingdom to which it stands, who could do the very thing to us that Abraham went to such great lengths to keep from happening to himself. Because there are people in this world who, as representatives of those interests, could stand up and say, I made the church rich. Well, what people? What interest? How could anything like that happen? How could anyone outside the church ever presume to govern the church? Come back next week and I'll tell you. That's my lesson for today.